So I'm almost embarrassed to be presenting this award for Brian tonight. There are so many people who are far more esteemed than I am to be presenting this award. Saying that it's an honor to present this award is probably the understatement of my career. Brian has been the backbone of the social justice movement in Atlanta and the legal community, particularly for the past over 35 years. But you might not know it if you haven't had to call on him. He is soft-spoken, he's extremely humble, he's not a self-promoter. He's the person, and I know this because now I've done a lot of Google searches, he's on the pleadings, but he's never in the press. You don't hear about him in the news, but every single case you look at, he's co-counsel. Brian came to Atlanta in the late 1970s and immediately threw himself into the civil rights movement after moving here from San Francisco, defending tenants from mass evictions. Speaking with colleagues, almost all of his stories involved eerie, long, dark rides through nowhere, Georgia. He's always heading for trouble somewhere. He's probably sued every single county in Georgia, which is no small feat, as many of you know. There are lots of counties here. Early in his time in Georgia, he met one of his closest friends, Judge Johnny Mason, when they drove together to Selma, Alabama. He's always looking for a way that he can help. They had driven there to see what support they could provide when they heard that there were racially motivated ethics complaints against African-American attorneys who were in the civil rights movement. Brian drove a long way again in 1980 when he sued Sheriff Roland Adaway in Johnson County after the sheriff there instigated an attack against African Americans protesting his refusal to hire black officers. The sheriff had arrested nearly 100 people who were protesting without any charges, so when Brian showed up, he threw him out. Brian actually said to me last night that he's only been thrown out of jail 3 times, and Ellen told me that this is one of them, and I don't know if this was one of the ones included in the only 3 times. Brian represented all of those who were arrested, and although an all-white jury ruled against Brian's clients, Brian uncovered the reality of what the community was living with there. In the testimony in the lawsuit, which is published in the New York Times now, the sheriff stated, well, if the blacks just wouldn't demonstrate, I wouldn't have to arrest them. It's in the testimony. Only a year after that, Brian filed his first of many lawsuits against the Ku Klux Klan. He sued for a shotgun attack of the home of a former NAACP official. Daniel Levitas, the director of the Center of Democratic Renewal, said that Brian's history with the National Anti-Klan Network was extensive and legendary, as he brought suit on behalf of numerous victims of Klan violence and harassment. Morris Dees, the co-founder and chief trial counsel of the Southern Poverty Law Center, said that Brian is a brilliant lawyer and has been a great co-counsel with the SPLC over the years. For example, in 1987, SCLP and Brian filed suit against 3 Klan organizations for an attack on a peaceful King holiday march in Forsyth County. This lawsuit resulted in 2 out of the 3 Klan organizations having to file bankruptcy. In 1990, Brian again continued his scary rides through Georgia with Dan Levitas down in Early County. The fire department there provided little or no protection to black neighborhoods. However, when 2 African-American very young children were killed in a neglected area by the fire department, Brian and Dan showed up and sued the city of Blakely. And of course they countersued and they said, how dare you in your lawsuit accuse us of being involved with the KKK? So Brian defended the countersuit, including one of the plaintiffs was C.T. Vivian. And it was just an opportunity for him to expose the truth, because we got the phone records, as Dan said, from the city, and they showed that the chief, the fire chief, had a bad habit of calling the Klan headquarters in Oakwood, Georgia, from his desk phone in the city fire department. The city had to drop the suit at that point. There are countless more stories like this, and I'm sure many people in here have more stories that I'm not going to bring up today. Natsu Saito actually told me about his role in fighting attacks on historically black colleges in Atlanta in the 1970s. Many of you might know that Brian co-counseled a successful case against the Fulton County Sheriff's Department for the negligent failure to protect Judge Roland Barnes, who was murdered in his own courtroom. And of course, he also served as co-counsel for both of the challenges of anti-immigration statutes that were passed in Alabama and Georgia. Partially successful. He's provided free legal representation for probably every major progressive movement in Atlanta. The NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, anti-nuclear protests in Savannah, protesters at the School of Americas in Columbus, homeless advocates in protests in Atlanta, the Grady Coalition to fight to retain prescription drug coverage for the poor, anti-war protesters who sat in Senator Miller's office before the first Iraq War. Occupy, he was there. Post-Ferguson, he was there. And by the way, he wasn't just there representing the protesters. He was also, we stood side by side at Ferguson and some parts of Occupy as well. So these are remarkable stories and historic stories. But what makes Brian my hero was when I got to know him and saw that his everyday cases that he has stuck to throughout his career are remarkable. For decades, Brian has challenged conditions in prisons throughout Georgia, resulting in the closing of many old jails and reconstruction to make new jails. In 2013, he obtained the largest settlement for a prisoner wrongful death case in Georgia history. I kept pulling all of these cases on Fastcase and other places, trying to find these amazing victories. And I found that I was struck more so by the unsuccessful cases. The ones that are identical to what we're seeing in Charleston now, we're seeing in Baltimore right now. They're facing prosecution, but these facts, they are almost identical, just that they were brought in the 1990s, the early 90s, and the early 2000s, and he lost because he was that lone voice in the desert, if you will, saying, no, 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 this is not normal behavior. Our officers should not be abusing our individuals in this horrific manner. He is a founding member of the Police Accountability Project of the National Lawyers Guild, which is one of the largest coalitions of attorneys tirelessly fighting these police brutality atrocities. Every single person I spoke to emphatically affirmed that Brian is a legal genius. He is the stuff of legends. He's the guy you call when you realize that your case is way bigger than you thought. Jerry Weber said, whenever I have this, have I seen this before issue, Brian has said, oh yeah, I've briefed it, and I've already dealt with this before. Let me show you how it's done. Albert Wan said that he was lucky enough to observe Brian take a deposition of an ex-jailer in a jail suicide case. And Albert was saying he literally scared the crap out of me. He reamed this defendant and, really scared this opponent. He's argued before the Georgia Supreme Court in the 11th Circuit countless times. Christy Grunke from SCLP states, when Brian is at the podium, it is because everyone in the room agrees that he is the best and obvious choice, not because he elbows or grandstands his way there. In fact, I only discovered last night, Atlanta Legal Aid, my organization, had reached out for support from him for the Strickland case that just struck down the garnishment law in Georgia as unconstitutional. So I said, I feel like such a small fry presenting this award. It sounds like complete absurd. You're like, oh, it's an honor. But I'm also a testament of Brian's success because I think that Brian probably single-handedly has fostered dozens of young attorneys, many of them are probably in this room, who stuck with civil rights and stuck with public interest because of him and through his example. And while preparing for this evening, I discovered that because of Brian, I also have this huge social justice family that are kind of brothers and sisters who all call Brian his mentor. There's probably not a single person I reached out to who didn't say, yeah, Brian's my mentor. And not just like the mentor that gives you advice. He's the one that feeds you. Jerry Weber says, Brian has been the constant in civil rights litigation for me for over 20 years. Without Brian, I would not have thought it possible to strike out and do civil rights work on my own. When Georgia Lord was gathering courage to make the leap to civil rights work, he offered her a free space to work at. Albert Wan, I wouldn't be here today with a viable law practice had it not been for Brian. Like me, Brian gave Albert work when we were trying to get on our feet and trying to figure out whether or not we should just jump to the big firms, jump away from public interest. Azadeh Shashahani states that He is unbelievably generous with his time and always on point on the law. Brian's ability to support and empower others is also best exemplified for the love that he has poured into his actual family. His wife of over 30 years, who just won an award last week herself for her work recounting environmental injustice in Alabama, and is a tenured professor at the University of Alabama. His daughter teaches in the DC public school system, and his son is also here today. He traveled from Palestine, where he gathers young people together on both sides of the conflict in the hopes of sowing some seeds of peace. And you can ask him about that afterwards. They always need support. Jeff Filipovitz, who I believe actually is co-counseling right now with Brian on a case challenging a local jail that allows only postcards as correspondence, says that he's one of the few reasons I have stuck around and built a practice out of 1983 cases. Brian is probably one of the reasons that many of us, tempted by the likes of San Francisco, where everybody agrees with us, the likes of public, corporate work, leaving the practice altogether, have stuck around to practice public interest law in Georgia. Brian, you are a legend to so many of us. The civil rights community is indebted to you for the work and generous support that you have provided to all of us. It is truly my honor to present the Legal Legends Award to you.